And for more on these allegations, because that's all they are right now, let's bring in our senior correspondent, Owen Alterman. Hello there, Owen. Certainly explosive, to say the very least. Apparently this meeting was recorded with 2 copies floating around somewhere. Should we be indulging in any of this?
Look, Sarah, it's obviously a he says type of situation, although in this case, both sides could, in theory, be telling the truth. On one hand, Jabri could be telling the truth about what Mohammed bin Salman did to him and did and said about doing to others. And on the other hand, MBS and his lawyers could be telling the truth when they say that Jabri had defrauded the country and is guilty or liable for stealing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Obviously, this goes to the complexity of Mohammed bin Salman, right? And this is covered, in fairness, to some extent, in the 60 Minutes piece. On one hand, someone who is doing a lot to modernize the country, really appealing to the young population there, really going after corruption potentially. On the other hand, someone who has tendencies, we saw this in the Jabal Khashoggi killing, and that's proven, right, to go out and do some very, very untoward things, to say the least. So again, this gets to the complexity of this figure, Mohammed bin Salman. Obviously, in many parts of the West, he's not liked. In Israel, he's somewhat more popular because of what's been seen about his opinions toward our country and his ability and his interest in normalizing with Israel as part of his modernization program. So Israelis, Sarah, I think, are inclined to give Mohammed bin Salman much more of a free pass than are those in other countries who in some ways have less at stake in his rise.
Yeah, so there you, Owen, you mentioned the Khashoggi case, which happened in Istanbul, I believe, last year, the 2019 even. Can we expect to hear any sort of rebuke here from MBS or his camp with these allegations?
Look, they answered the 60 Minutes piece, Sarah, by saying that Saad Jabri is essentially a former official who's disgruntled, who's been charged with, and there's evidence to support him, is basically defrauding the country of massive amounts of money. So they dismiss his claims that way and then focus attention on the modernization program. You know, there is another interesting thing that was brought out in the 60 Minutes piece, but I think not really discussed enough, and that's Saad Jabri's claim that MBS sees himself as another version of Alexander the Great, that that's his model. And Jabri talks about that in the sense of MBS wanting to be all powerful and to build a kind of empire. But there's another element in the Alexander the Great comparison that I think MBS also wants us to focus on, and that's this. Alexander the Great was known as coming to the Middle East and, in a sense, spreading modernization, right? Spreading Hellenistic culture throughout the region, and in a way that was culturally sensitive to the extent that even in Jewish sources that weren't at the time all that receptive to Greek culture, to say the least, had a positive impression of Alexander because he balanced the two, the need to be sensitive to the existing cultures and the imperative to bring this modernization. And maybe MBS sees himself as in channeling that element of Alexander the Great, again, going to the complexity of this very, very important figure. And 60 Minutes is certainly right to focus on him as someone who was young, who was up and coming, and by all accounts set to really become not only de facto, but de jure, the ruler of a very, very important country. But again, someone with much more complexity than I think this interview really was able to bring out. Not to mention the fact, Sarah, that we are dealing with claims that at the end of the day can't be fully substantiated, even if 60 Minutes brings in a character witness, a former acting CIA director, to at least vouch for Saad al-Jabri. It may not be enough to really prove these claims, but certainly it's fair to put them out in the public domain.